Welcome, everyone, to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is our sixth lesson, and today we're going to be reviewing Daf 35 through 41. Okay, last week we learned or were introduced to a new concept. The concept is kimale biderabamine or kamale. And the concept is basically that if a person is liable for two separate punishments, then the person is going to get the more stringent punishment. So we're in the middle of a discussion. The Gemara is asking, is it for all punishments that if there's, as long as there are two different punishments, you only get the more stringent one? And the Gemara is giving us different different groupings of punishments to see how far this principle goes. So the Gemara tells us at the top of Daf 35, if someone is supposed to get killed because they killed somebody else, then they don't pay any monetary fine. So again, if they're deserving of death and they're supposed to pay a monetary fine, that monetary fine they're exempt from, and they only get killed, meaning they get, not only, but they get the more severe punishment. If someone kills an animal, and here the Gemara says that here we're discussing intent, right? So the Gemara tells us that it doesn't matter what the person's intent was, whether it was on purpose or by accident. Either way, the person needs to pay back whatever damages he did. So too, if someone did something inadvertently, then he would have to be liable for whatever punishment he gets. And therefore, even if he is not going to be put to death, he still doesn't pay the fine. And here also the Gemara continues that a person who is supposed to get lashes also doesn't pay a fine. Meaning, again, when we have lashes and a fine, you get the fine and you're exempt from, you get the lashes and you're exempt from the fine. However, according to Rabbah, which is another opinion here in the Gemara, a penalty of the word is knas. Knas means a fine. If you have a fine, Rabbah says that's an exception, and therefore, even if you're liable for death, you should also be liable to pay this fine. But maybe not if it's lashes or if it's karet, which we know is something that is done by God. Apparently, then if you have that with a fine, so then maybe that would not be the case. So here the Gemara tells us that our Mishnah that we read last week actually says that if you have karet, meaning a death from God, meaning he's going to exact that punishment, and you're supposed to pay a fine, you still pay the fine, even if you were not warned beforehand, meaning there is no concept of kimle in that sense, and therefore you get both punishments, one corporal and one monetary. Okay, the Gemara brings a braita, a source that tells us that women who are forbidden for the man to marry, again, we're still in the same situation, or the case is if a man seduces or violates a woman. Remember, we learned last week, if he does this, he needs to pay a fine. However, says this braita, that if this woman is someone who is forbidden to him, meaning he can't marry her, then he does not pay the fine for rape or seduction. So too a woman who's an Ailonit. If you remember, the Ailonit was the woman who never goes through and develops sexual organs in the sense of is infertile in the sense that never goes through puberty. A woman who never goes through puberty is called an Ailonit. And the Gemara explains that this concept of the woman who is violated, who is a Na'ara, remember last week we defined that as a girl who's between 12 and 12 and a half. So she's past puberty, but she's not a full-fledged adult, which is called bogeret. That's 12 and a half. So the Gemara explains that an Ailonit will never be a Na'ara because she doesn't go through puberty. Therefore, this whole case does not apply to her. So too a woman who does mi'un. If you remember, we learned that a woman, or girl, I should say, whose father died and her brother marries her off to somebody else, this minor, this girl, has the ability to get out of the marriage till she's 12 years old. So if she did that, we are not sure if she is still a virgin because in theory she was already married, and therefore again she does not the man does not have to pay the fine if she was seduced or violated. So too a woman who leaves her husband because of a bad reputation, a shem ra, she also does not get a knas. Again, if she's married already, we assume that she is not a virgin anymore, and therefore these verses do not apply to her. The top of 36 explains to us again that the woman that we're talking about in these cases must be a woman that he can marry, and therefore if he cannot marry her, meaning if she's forbidden to him, then there's no case of having to pay the fine. It seems from our Gemara that it seems to be supporting the sages who say that even though I mentioned the fact that she needs to be a na'ara, meaning a young girl a young woman between 12 and 12 and a half, the sages say from age 3 to 12 and a half would be a girl who would get this fine if these terrible things would happen to her. Okay. The Gemara continues that we go to the idea of a woman who is either deaf, mute, or insane. These women are believed to say that they were raped, meaning they have the ability to say that. And since we're talking about, I guess, women who have, I guess, impairments, so the Gemara continues and tells us that a husband can't claim that his wife, who's blind, wasn't a virgin before she got married. And this, I think, is just very interesting, or I would say very sensitive of the Gemara to say. The Gemara says that it's important to realize that a blind girl is probably bumping into a lot of things, is probably falling down a lot, and she wouldn't see that if she fell, she wouldn't know that she was bleeding, and therefore that she lost her bitulim, her virginity, and therefore the husband cannot claim that this was, a false relationship, right? That they didn't tell him beforehand that she wasn't a virgin. That is not the case with a woman who is blind. What about, we mentioned a woman who, something about a bad reputation. So here the Gemara explains on Daf 36 that a woman who had a bad reputation when she was younger, so then that would affect if she gets this fine or not. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, we don't listen to rumors. How could it be that we're listening to these rumors? So the Gemara says, you're right. If there were witnesses that came and said that this woman was inappropriate when she was younger, so then she does not get the fine that she was the fine that was due to her or should have been given to her, because we're not sure if she is a betula. Okay. The next Mishnah on Daf 36 tells us that a convert a woman who converted, or a woman who was taken captive and released, and a servant who was, again, a servant who is set free. If these things happened after they were 3 years old, then they also do not get a knas, right? They do not get um, the the fine, the penalty does not go to them, because again, here we assume that they weren't betulot, they weren't virgins at the time that this incident happened. Rabbi Yehuda argues about the captive, and he said, if you remember, we did discuss a woman who was taken captive, if we assume that she was violated or not. And he basically says we don't assume that she was violated, and therefore she remains in the chazakah, in the assumption that she is still a betula. If he and the Mishnah continues that if a person rapes his daughter or his granddaughter, again here we're talking about prohibited relationships, then there's no knas. He doesn't pay the fine, but here he doesn't pay the fine because he deserves to get killed. Here we do have the principle of kimle, where he's going to get the more stringent punishment, which is death, as opposed to paying the fine. The Gemara now explains that, remember we said about the captive, do we assume that she was violated or not? The Gemara says that the captor might have touched her, but we don't assume that she was violated, and therefore her ketuvah is still going to be 200 zuz. We assume that she is still a bitula. Right, and it continues by saying that a priest, a kohen, can even marry this captive when she was released, meaning it's proving that we don't assume that she was violated, or maybe not. Maybe he cannot marry her if he's the one who testified about her. If he testified about her but didn't redeem her, maybe he cannot marry her. Or, again, there's another opinion that he can marry her. Daf 37 tells us that if an adult woman converts, and now she sees blood, and here we're going to go into the world of purity and impurity. The question is, right, here we're discussing in the time where women were dealing with things that needed to remain pure, right? Let's say this was a woman who is married to a kohen, married to a priest, and the food that she has in her house has sanctity. Therefore, we have to be careful that if she does get her period, she doesn't touch the food, because then it would make the food impure. So what happens if this woman who's a convert, if she does see blood, she only is impure from now, the moment she saw the blood, and forward, right from then on, but not retroactively, as opposed to a regular Jewish woman, meaning a woman who's Jewish from birth. If she would see blood, she actually is seen as retroactively impure, either for the past 24 hours or from the last time she checked. And therefore, anything she would have touched in the last 24 hours would actually become impure. So here we're saying that seems to be that there's a distinction between this convert and this woman who just converted, as opposed to a woman who is Jewish from birth. Or the Gemara says, no, she's like every other woman, and it goes retroactively as well. So too here, again, what we're trying to show are differences between a woman who converts. So the Gemara says that after this woman who's an adult, if she converts, she needs to wait 3 months after her conversion in order to get married. Again, we are concerned that maybe she had relations before she converted, and therefore we want to make sure that we know who the child's father is. And from here, we get into a discussion. She would be different than the captive, the woman who was taken captive, because that woman will protect herself. Whereas the convert, before she converted, why would she protect herself? Or no, again, the woman who's captive also needs to wait 3 months because, how could she have protected herself? Maybe she was violated and had no control over the situation, as opposed to the convert who, again, as we know, for most converts, it's not something you just wake up and decide to do from one day to the next. The convert knows that she wants to convert, and therefore she will be very careful and protect herself before she converts. Um, so too suggests the Gemara that the woman who is violated or seduced, she also needs to wait 3 months because, again, we're concerned. Or maybe she doesn't need to wait 3 months because she will protect herself somehow from getting pregnant. And here we're going to continue on Daf 37 to discuss different sources for kimle, again, for the idea that if you are liable for two two different punishments, that you only get the more stringent one. And again, here the Gemara compares different combinations of punishment, right? If it's death and having to pay, so you get death and you don't pay. What about lashes and payment? The same thing. You only get one punishment and you don't pay. According to Rabbi Meir, for death and payment, that's true. But what about, he adds, what about if you're supposed to get death and lashes? Still, you only get one of them, meaning the more stringent one. But he does say that if it's lashes and payment, you actually get both lashes and payment. The Gemara, since we're talking about payment and death, the Gemara says it's very important to recognize that you can't pay your way out of getting killed, right? If you are deserving of death, there is no sum of money that you can pay that will get you out of that situation. And therefore, so too, you can't pay instead of going to the Ir Miklat. The Ir Miklat was, we actually just read it last week's Parsha. The Ir Miklat was the city of refuge that was set up in Israel for a person who inadvertently killed somebody, meaning he killed somebody by mistake. He can run to a city of refuge, and that will protect him from the family members of the victim. So the Gemara tells us you can't pay money instead of going to the city of refuge. You have to go there directly. From here, the Gemara brings up another idea, and that is the ceremony of the Egla Arufa. Egla Arufa is the calf that is decapitated. And this case is the case is that, let's say a body is found outside or in between two separate cities. And this is for those of you who like crime shows. They can't figure out who the murderer is. They don't know who's responsible, and the body seems to be equidistant between two cities. Then they bring the elders of both cities, and they meet in a meeting place between the two cities, and they bring this calf, and they basically decapitate this animal. And from here they say, right, we are basically saying that we were not responsible for the death of the person. Fascinatingly, the idea is that a city is responsible for the people who come to visit it. And if you didn't, help the people who are leaving the city, or you didn't provide some sort of protection, you seem to be liable or responsible for that person's death. And here, since we're not sure which city is responsible, we do this. Ceremony. So the Gemara tells us that if they do the ceremony and then they find the murderer still gets killed, right? Don't think that doing the ceremony gets him off of getting killed. And since we're bringing up Egla Arufa, the Gemara tells us that someone who's deserving of death, we kill him, right? And he's supposed to get death by the sword, so we kill him by his neck, and that's learned from Egla Arufa. Just like they kill this animal by its neck, so to a person you kill by its neck. So the Gemara says, oh, if you're already going to compare one to the other, with the animal, you kill it actually with an axe, and you do it from the back. And the Gemara says we do not do that with a person. We do it from the front with a sword. And the question is why? And I think this is just a fascinating line. The Gemara says, because it says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you should love your fellow man like yourself. Therefore, you need to give the person a good death, right? Even someone who's deserving of death, you need to give that person a good death, meaning as painless as possible, or in the most dignified way. And we don't want them to suffer in an extra way. And therefore, just interesting, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," you kill him in a good way. Which is just an interesting interpretation of the pasuk, right? We usually use that pasuk to say, you have to love your friend, you have to do all these good things. It's fascinating that the Gemara will talk about actually giving someone the death penalty, but doing it in a nice way. So I just thought that was just very interesting. Okay. Someone since we're talking about death and death by capital punishment, so the Gemara tells us that someone who is going to be killed by the court, that person doesn't have a value. What does that mean, right? What we would call dead man walking, right? Because he's about to get killed, that person does not have a value, and therefore we haven't really learned this yet, but there's something called erchin. Erchin literally means value, right? A person can say, I want to give your value to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, right? I want to give a donation. How do I tell you how much I want to give? I want to give my neighbor's value, right? So if you say, I want to give his value, and that person has been convicted of a capital offense, it doesn't work, right? Because that person doesn't have value, which is, again, very interesting. Or the Gemara says, no, that's not true. Because erech, right, value is something objective, and that's not something that changes based on your actions. And really, you still have a value. Daf 38 brings up the Ir Miklat again, right? The city of refuge, as we mentioned before. Going to a city of refuge is only for someone who kills bishogeg, right? Bishogeg means inadvertently, though the Gemara, not in this Masechet, but in another Masechet, will be very specific on what that person needs to do. Wait, Lynn is asking, can a person's value be given more than once, and even without one's personal? Yes, you can give a person's value as much as you want. It's basically a way of saying how much you want to give, right? Instead of saying 100 shekel, you can say the value of this person. It's an objective value. There's actually, it's based on verses in the Torah. The Torah tells us every person has an objective value, not subjective, but based on your sex and your age, you have a very clear value, and that can be given more than once, yes, and it has nothing to do with a person's permission. So excellent question. It is something just very objective. Um, Okay. As we said before, going to the city of refuge is only bishogeg if you did it inadvertently, but not on purpose. And either way, right, you cannot pay a certain value in order to get out of that, right? There's no way of getting out of that punishment. It is a punishment. Okay. Again, you might have thought that you're only exempt if it was one action. If you remember last week, we were trying to discuss when kimule actually comes into effect. Is it one action? If you remember, we talked about stealing and carrying on Shabbat at the same exact time. But even if you do two actions, though simultaneously, then you would be, again, you would also be liable. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us, again, I think it's very important for us to understand that when we're talking about this young maiden who is violated, and I think I said this last week, I'm just going to say it again. This week, we're speaking in a very technical way. How much does he pay? Who is he going to pay to? We're going to discuss today. It seems very dry. There doesn't seem to be a lot of emotion, and it's really important to understand that the Gemara is not saying that this is okay, right? This is a terrible thing. And we are just trying to understand the ramifications or the limitations of the verse. So when the verse said that the girl is a na'ara, right, we said it's a very specific age. And the verse also tells us that she was single. So now the Mishnah tells us that if this na'ara was engaged and then she became divorced and then she was raped, it's a machloket if he has to pay the fine or not. Because at the moment, she is not engaged, right? She's single and she's still a virgin. She's still a betula because she was never married. She was just engaged and then she was divorced. If she does get the fine, the question is, who does the fine go to? Again, in the Torah, the verse says that the fine goes to the father, right? He has to give 50 shekel to the father. However, maybe it will go to her. So that's what the Gemara is going to discuss now. Again, as I mentioned, the verse says if she wasn't engaged. Therefore, if she was engaged, it seems that she does not get this fine. Or maybe, yes, she gets the fine, but if she wasn't engaged, it goes to the father. And if she was engaged, now it goes to her. It's just interesting to understand. It's important to realize that the 50 shekel that we've been discussing, which is the fine that he needs to pay, is the same value as 200 zuz. Right? If you remember, we started this Masechet saying that a betula gets 200 zuz as her ketuvah. So it seems very interesting and on purpose, right, that if this man rapes this virgin, this betula, that he would have to pay the same amount, meaning 50 shekel, which is the same value, because now she's no longer a betula and cannot get that value for her ketuvah. So that's just interesting to understand. So Rabbi Akiva says that she does get the fine. In a Breita, he actually says that the father gets the fine. So we're going to try to understand what this means. Now, if she was raped when she was engaged, then he actually gets the death penalty. He gets skila, which is stoning. And again, as we mentioned before, if he's going to get killed, he is not going to pay the fine. Let's say if he raped her and then not related to the incident, then let's say she died, um, then he does not pay the fine, meaning she has to be alive in order to pay the fine, though we're going to discuss that in a little bit as well. What happens if, again, he rapes her and then she dies, and then again, not because of him. Obviously, if she dies because of the rape, he killed her, right? So that's just important to understand. Meaning, if let's say she later on gets into a car accident and dies. And then at the time of the court case, she would have turned 12 and a half. So now this is important to understand, and we're going to say it more clearly in a little bit. But there's the crime. I will call it, I was saying incident, but I don't like that, right? There was the crime. And then there's the court case. In Hebrew, it's called ha'amada badin, right? They go to court, and then there is the verdict. So we're going to see that when they get to court is the pivotal moment that's going to decide if he's going to pay or not, and who he's going to pay to. So if, let's say, again, he rapes her, then she dies, and then they get to court, and if at that time she would have already been 12 and a half, the question is, does the payment go to her? Now, if you remember, there is no her, but let's say if she had a child, that the payment can go to the child. Or no, the money goes to the father because when it happened, she was a na'ara, right? She was a na'ara when the crime was committed, and therefore maybe the money goes to the father. Now, if you're following, we just suggested that the crime was committed when she was a na'ara, between 12 and 12 and a half. When they get to court, she is a bogeret. She is now 12 and a half. And we just suggested that maybe she had a child. Now, that would be quite difficult if, first of all, we said that that it happened a few months ago, and that she was 12. And from here, Daf 39 gets into a discussion if a 12-year-old can even become pregnant, right? So the Gemara tells us on Daf 39 that there are 3 women who are allowed to use birth control: a minor, a woman who's pregnant, and a woman who's nursing. All of these are to prevent pregnancy, right? We don't want these people to get pregnant. What does it mean, a minor? So the Gemara says between 11 and 12. So that seems to imply that she could get pregnant between 11 and 12. And now the Gemara asks, but wait a minute, how could she have a son, right? She was a na'ara, and in those 6 months, she couldn't have gotten pregnant and had a child, right? It's only 6 months between a na'ara and a bogeret, right? You can't get raped, pregnant, have a child, and die in 6 months. So that's an interesting question. So the Gemara now says, again, maybe when she dies, that makes her into a bogeret, meaning not that she's really 12 and a half when she died, but maybe that's what makes her a bogeret. Now here the Gemara tells us that if she dies, the father loses the right to the penalty, to the knas, because she is no longer alive. What if, now in the next case, if he raped her and then she gets engaged, so then he pays the father the knas, right, the money. But if she gets married, then he pays her and not the father. And again, as we mentioned, if she becomes a bogeret afterwards, an adult, meaning 12 and a half, then he pays her. Okay, next Mishnah. If he seduces her, now it's very important. We've been discussing the knas, the penalty, the 50 shekel, but it's very important to understand that there are other payments that he needs to make as well. So now the Mishnah tells us if he seduces her, he needs to pay 3 payments: boshet, which means her embarrassment; pgam, which is her depreciation, right? She is now not a betula anymore, and the knas, right? The fine, the 50 shekel. And if he raped her, there's a fourth payment, which is tsar, right? Her suffering. Um, Okay, ones again with rape, he pays her right away. Mefateh with seduction, he pays if he divorces her, because for mefateh for seduction, he actually needs to marry her, and then if he divorces her, then he will pay the fine. With excuse me, with rape, he must marry her, even if he doesn't want to. With seduction, he doesn't need to stay married to her. As we mentioned, he can divorce her. He can divorce her. The Gemara is going to explain this more. So let's go. That is an excellent question. So Leah is asking a very important question, right? Did women really marry their rapists? That is an excellent question. I have no idea. Let's start like that. I have no idea. Um, it I don't know. I think that these dapim this subject, I think, is very sensitive. I think that we are looking at it through very modern sensitivities. That being said, I'm not sure if the sensitivities 2,000 years ago were the same or not. I could construct a case again. I think that we've seen this time and time again. A woman wants to be married, definitely in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and even if you read, Jane Eyre, and you read books from even 100 years ago, a woman needs or wants to be taken care of, and it seems to be that exactly as Zohar is mentioning, right? When we say that he needs to marry her, first of all, it's to protect her. And second of all, it's a deterrent, meaning he better realize that if he's going to do this, this is a commitment, right? This is not just you can't just do whatever you want, but you are going to have to I would say suffer the consequences. And exactly as Lynn is saying, the woman does have the option to decline. We're going to see that right now in the Gemara. The woman does have the option to decline. The man does not, meaning he needs to suffer the consequences. So again, I agree with you 100%. These lines are very, I think, very troubling to us, discussing these issues of rape and seduction. Again, I think that I really believe that these things are here to protect the woman. A, to protect the woman, and B, to deter the men, right? And not the men shouldn't feel that they can do whatever they want and that there's no consequence, but there are consequences to their actions. So I don't know if that makes you feel better, but I agree with you 100%. These are very challenging dapim. Um, Okay, so let's continue, right? And again, it's going to get a little worse before it gets better. But here, the Gemara on Daf 39 discusses tsar. What does it mean that he has to pay for her suffering? And it goes through again. What did she suffer? Is it the physical act? Is it the fact that he threw her on the ground? It's very, I would say, even triggering. It is very disturbing. But I think again, it's a deterrent. It's saying men cannot do whatever they want. There are consequences to their actions. Again, the assumption here is that if she was seduced, then the act was consensual, and therefore he does not pay tsar. He doesn't pay suffering because she didn't suffer at the time of the act. But he does pay all the other things: boshet, embarrassment, and pgam, her depreciation. He does pay all of those payments. As we said, for seduction, if he doesn't marry her, then he does need to pay the knas. But boshet and pgam, he's always going to pay right away. Um, Again, the father, and as we mentioned here, not only the daughter, but also the father can say that they don't want him to marry her. So there is control. They do have the right to say, that they don't want this. For rape, again, she can say that she doesn't want to marry him. Her father can also stop the marriage, but he cannot say that he doesn't want to. He has to marry her. With Mifateh, however, he can say that he doesn't want to marry her. Again, if he does that, he needs to pay the payment. With rape, he cannot. He cannot say he doesn't want to marry her. He must marry her. As I mentioned, the knas, the payment, is instead of her ktuva. Uh, Therefore, if he marries her and he paid the knas, then if he divorces her, he doesn't have to pay the ktuva, meaning it's the same payment because he already paid the knas. If he dies, the same thing. Again, that payment of 50 shekel is seen as equal to the ktuva, and you don't get both. You get one or the other. Daf 40 tells us, it compares, again, rape and violation and seduction. So they are compared, but they're not the same. Again, as we mentioned, if he seduces her, he doesn't have to marry her if he doesn't want to. If she is forbidden for him to marry her, right? If it's a forbidden relationship, right, obviously he can't marry her, um, and he's not allowed to marry her. Okay, next Mishnah. What if it's a girl who's an orphan, and she got engaged and then she got divorced? If he raped her, there is a knas, right? He does have to pay the fine. But if he seduced her, he does not need to pay the fine. What does this mean? Again, the knas, the money goes to her if she was raped, but if she agreed to, right, if it was seduction and she agreed to, it was consensual, so then there is no fine. Okay, next Mishnah. As we mentioned, the different payments. So here the Mishnah is going to explain. Boshet, which means embarrassment, is subjective. It's based on both people, meaning we look at the perpetrator and the victim, and the court decides how much embarrassment payment she gets. Pgam, which means depreciation, that's how much she was worth beforehand versus how much she is worth now, as opposed to knas, which is the 50 shekel, that is objective and equal to everybody. It doesn't matter who she is, he needs to pay the 50 shekel. Here, the Gemara tells us that shekel and sela are the same. It's two different currencies, but they're interchangeable. And from here, we're going to talk about other payments. So if a person's ox killed a servant, he needs to pay 30 shekel, right? Again, an objective payment. It doesn't matter what his subjective value is. It's equal to everyone. So too, in our case, 50 shekel doesn't matter, if she was a princess or a kohen or a poor girl. Either way, it's 50 shekel. As we mentioned, all of the payments go to the father because, again, she's still living in his house. So too, anything that she earns goes to her father. So now let's talk about pgam. How do we evaluate her depreciation? Right, the Gemara says, how much would someone have paid for a servant who is a virgin as opposed to a servant who's not a virgin? That would be the difference in value. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us whenever there's so now we're going to talk about the relationship between the father and the daughter. So whenever the father has the ability to sell his daughter, then he doesn't pay a knas. Sorry, he doesn't get the knas, um, but because she's a minor. But if he can't sell her, meaning now she's a na'ara, she's 12 years old. If he can't sell her, now he gets the knas, he gets the fine to him. Again, this is according to Rabbi Meir, who says that our case is very limited between the age of 12 and 12 and a half. Again, the sages say no, it's between the ages of 3 and 12 and a half. Okay. Here, there's the concept of someone who, what's called motzi shem ra. The husband is giving this girl a bad reputation, a bad name, right? So if a man marries this a young girl, a ktana, a minor, um, so then he's exempt to pay this payment. Again, like if he claims that she wasn't a virgin when they got married, so this he does not have to pay the knas if she was a minor as opposed to a ne'ara. Okay, Daf 41, the Mishnah tells us if a person admits, right, if he admits that he seduced a girl, so then he pays boshet and pgam, he pays the embarrassment and the depreciation, but he does not pay the fine, right? Because the Gemara is going to explain that if a person admits to doing something wrong, they pay the principal value, but they don't pay any fines which are above the value of what they incurred. What if someone says, I stole something, right? So he pays back the principal value, but not any fine, meaning double or 4 or 5, which we mentioned previously. If he says, right, my ox killed a person or my ox killed another ox, he pays. But if he says my ox killed a servant, he doesn't pay. Because remember, we said if the ox kills a servant, it's an objective payment, which is not based on value, and therefore he doesn't pay. And the Mishnah tells us that if he needs to pay more than the actual value, so then if he admits it, he does not have to pay that payment. So the Gemara explains that this should be, of course, for rape as well. So the Gemara says yes. Or maybe for rape we don't believe him, and therefore we don't take the money because the father doesn't want to believe that this happened to his daughter. And again, I think it's fascinating. You know, we were talking about sensitivity. I think this daf is being extremely sensitive, right? The idea that someone is, embarrassed or doesn't want people to know that his daughter was raped or that she herself was raped. I think that these sensitivities we can see are timeless, right? So the Gemara is discussing, right? On one hand, if you admit it, so then you would get payment, or you can deny it and not get payment. And the Gemara is saying there's really that tension, meaning, for the woman to accept the money or for the father to accept the money, it's accepting that this really happened, and that's not so easy, right? The Gemara says, well, what if she does accept it? And the Gemara says, well, even if she accepts it, maybe the father doesn't want anybody to know. Or even if the father doesn't mind, maybe a family member doesn't want anybody to know. So it's just interesting that there are similar sensitivities, throughout the ages, fortunately or unfortunately. Okay, the rest of this daf is going to take us to the world of damages and torts. So I'm just going to bring up a few terms which are important. We have mentioned them in the past in passing, but I just want to bring them up now. So when we have a shore, an ox, or any animal, but usually we discuss oxen, we have two types of oxen. One is called tam, which means literally tame or innocent. This is an ox that has never done anything before. If you're familiar with the children's book Ferdinand, that's what I think of, right? Ferdinand is the bull who's just sitting under the tree, minding his own business, right? So the Gemara says that most ox do not go around, even though the book will disagree, but most ox don't go around goring for no reason, and that's called a shor tam. A shor tam, if he does do damage, the owner only has to pay half of the damage. It's called chatzi nezek. However, a shor mu'ad, which is an ox who already 3 times was warned, don't do it again, don't do it again. We know that this is a dangerous ox. Then you need to pay full payment. Okay, that's one concept. The next concept, I was using the word knas before. The word knas means a fine or a penalty. That is as opposed to the word mammon. Mammon means money. But here we're going to say there are 2 types of payment. One is the actual value, the mammon, the actual value of the damage, and the other is a knas, a penalty or a fine that someone would have to pay. So now the Gemara is going to tell us, when we said that the tame ox only has to pay half of the damage, is half the damage, is that seen as mammon, meaning the value, or is it a fine, a knas, right? And what's the nafkamina? What is the practical application? Because as we mentioned before, if he admits to something, that he did something, we said he has to pay the mammon, the value, but he does not have to pay a knas, a fine. So if it's chatzi nezek, if it's half the damage, I want to know, is it money or is it a fine? So here the Gemara goes back and forth to understand if the half payment is seen as a fine or as the actual damage. And therefore, the Gemara goes back and forth and brings various proofs. And in the end, it says that that this chatzi nezek, that half of the damage, is actually a fine and not just the value. But it seems that it's only based on certain scenarios. In certain scenarios, it is seen as value, and in certain scenarios, it is seen as a fine. From here, since we're talking about making a distinction between the damage, the value of the damage, and a fine, so the Gemara tells us that, as we know, especially in the time of our Gemara, there are 2 centers. One center, Jewish centers in Israel, and one in Bavel, in Babylonia. So the Gemara tells us that the court in Bavel was allowed to make someone liable to pay mammon, meaning damage, the value of the damage, but they didn't have the power to make someone pay a fine. So again, we need to understand if this, what payments are seen as value and what payments are seen as a fine. And therefore, again, if you have normal damage, so then that's seen as mammon, and in Bavel they could make you pay for it. But if an animal did unusual damage, then what you would have to pay is actually a fine, and that could not be done in Bavel. That could only be done in Israel. But the Gemara ends, or the chapter ends, by telling us either way, if you have a dangerous animal in your house or a ladder that's dangerous, you have to get rid of it right away, because if not, it's as if you have blood on your hands. And therefore, the Gemara tells us that dangerous items need to be removed from one's house so that you will not be liable for any one of these payments. And with that, we finish the third chapter in Masechet Ketubot, and we will continue on to the fourth chapter next week. So wishing everyone a wonderful week and a Shabbat Shalom, a Shavua Tov and Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.